Tonight, we explore the hidden story behind biblical and Abrahamic fears, not as doctrines or declarations, but as a quiet psychological inheritance shaped by human need, memory, and survival. A long, unfolding conversation between the mind and the unknown that began before writing, before temples, before certainty, when early humans looked into the night and sensed not only darkness, but attention. And in that attention, a question formed slowly and without words. What happens when nothing escapes being seen? Because across the ancient world, long before the names of gods were agreed upon, people felt the weight of observation in ways that were intimate rather than dramatic. The feeling that thoughts mattered, that intentions carried consequence, that even silence could be noticed. And this sensation did not emerge from fear alone, but from the fragile conditions of early communal life, where survival depended on trust, restraint, and shared rules that could not always be enforced by sight. And so the idea of an all-seeing presence arose gently, not as a threat, but as reassurance that order extended beyond the limits of human vision. And as you listen now, perhaps resting comfortably, you may notice how the idea of being seen does not always produce anxiety. Sometimes it produces calm, a sense that meaning exists even when no one is watching directly. And this duality lies at the heart of Abrahamic symbolism, where divine awareness functions both as comfort and constraint, guiding behavior while soothing uncertainty. And in early Mesopotamian cultures, gods were believed to observe cities from above, maintaining balance through unseen oversight, while in ancient Egypt, the heart was weighed not by human judges, but by cosmic order itself. And these ideas flowed gradually into later traditions, shaping the symbolic language of the Hebrew scriptures, Christianity, and Islam, where God was described as knowing the inner world as clearly as the outer, not to intrude, but to establish continuity between action and consequence. And psychologically, this continuity served an essential role, because when environments were unpredictable and life was easily lost, the belief that nothing was truly unnoticed created a sense of coherence, a framework where suffering, restraint, and sacrifice could be endured with meaning. And modern neuroscience offers insight here, showing that the human brain seeks patterns of causality, especially under stress, preferring a world where actions connect to outcomes rather than randomness. And myths of divine observation satisfied this need by extending causality beyond immediate perception. And yet, as these ideas took root, they also shaped the inner landscape. Because when observation becomes constant, it does not remain external for long, it is absorbed, becoming conscious, self-monitoring, and the quiet voice that evaluates thought itself. And this internalization is not inherently harsh. It can be protective, guiding behavior gently when external guidance is absent. And perhaps this is why these traditions emphasize intention as much as action, recognizing that the mind rehearses behavior long before it manifests. And as you rest with this thought, you may notice how your own mind observes itself, how awareness turns inward naturally in stillness, especially at night, when distractions fade and reflection deepens. And this inward gaze is ancient, shaped by generations who learned that survival depended not only on strength, but on restraint, cooperation, and foresight. And the stories that carried these lessons were never meant to be shouted. They were whispered into routine, prayer, and bedtime reflection, becoming part of the emotional background rather than the foreground of life. And this is where sacred fear differs from terror, because terror disrupts, while sacred fear regulates, creating boundaries that feel heavy yet stabilizing. And as we move slowly through this exploration, there is no need to judge these myths as true or false, because their power lies not in literal description, but in psychological function, in how they organized behavior, soothed uncertainty, and gave shape to the invisible pressures of communal living. And perhaps the most enduring question they leave us with is not whether God watches, but why the idea of being watched feels both unsettling and comforting at the same time, why it quiets some thoughts while amplifying others, and why, even in a modern world filled with cameras and data, the most powerful sense of observation still comes from within. And this question does not demand an answer tonight. It only invites reflection, a gentle awareness that as the world grows quiet, the mind naturally turns toward meaning, seeking coherence in stillness. And it is here, in this calm descent, that the ancient stories begin their work, not to frighten you into wakefulness, but to guide attention inward toward rest, where fear softens into understanding. And understanding slowly becomes sleep. As the idea of being seen settles gently into awareness, the narrative drifts backward in time, toward the earliest moments when human communities first imagined eyes that never closed, because the invention of all-seeing gods did not arise from abstract theology, but from lived necessity, shaped by fragile social bonds and environments where survival depended on cooperation, even when no one was watching. And in small early settlements, whether along the rivers of Mesopotamia, the valleys of the Nile, or the pastoral landscapes that later shaped Abrahamic tradition, human behavior could not always be enforced through presence alone, and so the mind reached for continuity, extending social awareness beyond physical limits through myth, creating the sense that order persisted even in solitude. And this was not initially a fearful idea, but a stabilizing one, because when danger came from famine, conflict, or nature itself, the belief that actions were witnessed by a larger order gave meaning to restraint, patience, and moral consistency. And anthropologists note that societies with strong shared beliefs about observation were better able to maintain trust, because individuals behaved predictably even in private, reducing internal conflict within the group. And over generations, this predictability became sacred, wrapped in divine imagery that transformed social necessity into cosmic principle. And across cultures, similar patterns emerged independently. In ancient China, where heaven observed harmony, in Vedic tradition, where cosmic law noticed deviation, and in Native American belief systems, where ancestral presence remained aware of conduct, all reflecting the same psychological insight, that humans behave differently when they feel observed, even symbolically. And modern neuroscience confirms this, showing that perceived observation activates self-regulation centers in the brain, increasing impulse control and ethical consistency. And when early myths described gods who saw everything, they were externalizing an internal mechanism, giving it narrative form so it could be shared, remembered, and respected. And this externalization was especially important in times before formal law, where consequence needed to feel certain even when enforcement was impossible. And as these ideas migrated into Abrahamic thought, divine observation became more intimate, not limited to action, but extending into intention, thought, and desire, reflecting a deepening understanding of human psychology, recognizing that behavior originates in the unseen interior long before it becomes visible. And as you rest now, you may notice how thoughts arise quietly, sometimes uninvited, sometimes fleeting, and how awareness of them can change their course without effort. And this mirrors the ancient realization that self-awareness itself functions as an inner witness, guiding conduct gently when external pressure fades. And this inner witness can feel heavy when misunderstood, but when approached calmly, it becomes a source of coherence rather than anxiety. And myths of all-seeing gods offered early humans a way to relate to this experience without becoming overwhelmed, framing it as relationship rather than scrutiny. And yet, as the sense of observation became internalized, it also began to shape emotional life, introducing feelings of guilt, responsibility, and reflection, emotions that would later be named and explored more deeply, but which first appeared as quiet sensations, a pause before action, a hesitation in thought, and these sensations were not signs of weakness, but of emerging complexity in human consciousness, marking the transition from instinct-driven behavior to reflective choice. And perhaps this is why the image of an all-seeing presence continues to surface in dreams, art, and stories. Because it represents the moment the mind learned to watch itself, to recognize that awareness could turn inward as easily as outward. And as this understanding settles into calm reflection, the question arises softly, without urgency, whether the fear associated with being seen came later, shaped by punishment and authority, while the original sensation was simply awareness itself, neutral and steady. And this question does not need resolution tonight, because it opens gently into the next layer of the story, where observation becomes judgment, and awareness begins to weigh itself, slowly, carefully, as the night continues its quiet work. As observation deepens and becomes familiar, the mind begins to feel its weight not only as presence, but as evaluation. And it is here that the idea of being seen slowly transforms into the feeling of being measured, a shift that did not occur suddenly, but unfolded across generations as societies grew larger, more complex, and more dependent on shared moral codes. And within Abrahamic tradition, this transition marked the movement from external awareness to internal conscience, where divine sight no longer hovered only above the world, but settled quietly within the individual, observing thought, intention, and impulse. And this internalization was both stabilizing and demanding, because when judgment moves inward, it cannot be escaped by distance or solitude. And ancient cultures recognized this shift intuitively, embedding it into narrative through imagery of hearts weighed, books recorded, and thoughts known, symbols that appear not only in biblical texts, but also in Egyptian afterlife judgment, Mesopotamian moral accounting, and later echoed in Greek philosophy, where the examined life became a virtue, all suggesting that humanity was learning to live with itself as witness. And psychologically, this development reflects the emergence of metacognition, the mind's ability to reflect on its own processes, a capacity that supports long-term planning, empathy, and ethical consistency, but also introduces vulnerability to rumination and guilt when left unbalanced. And myths provided structure for this vulnerability, framing judgment as part of a larger order rather than a personal failing, allowing individuals to situate their inner conflict within a meaningful framework. And as you rest now, perhaps noticing thoughts rise and fall without attachment, you may sense how awareness can observe without condemning. And this distinction is crucial, because the fear of divine judgment did not originate as punishment alone, but as guidance, a way of aligning behavior with collective survival. And in early agrarian societies, where resources were shared and actions had far-reaching consequences, internalized judgment helped prevent harm before it occurred, reducing conflict by encouraging restraint at the level of intention. And this restraint was not initially enforced through terror, but through story, ritual, and repetition, shaping emotional response long before conscious reasoning developed. And neuroscience supports this, showing that moral emotions such as guilt and responsibility activate deeply rooted neural circuits associated with social bonding, reinforcing behaviors that protect group stability. And when myths describe judgment, they were activating these circuits symbolically, teaching the nervous system how to regulate itself. And yet, over time, as authority structures hardened and survival pressures intensified, the tone of judgment sometimes shifted from guidance to threat, amplifying fear rather than balance, a transformation that would leave lasting impressions on the subconscious, particularly during quiet moments when the mind turns inward, such as at night. And this may explain why thoughts of judgment often surface during rest, when distractions fade and self-reflection deepens. And as this part of the narrative unfolds gently, it invites a question that remains unresolved for now. whether judgment was ever meant to frighten, or whether fear emerged later as a byproduct of misalignment between psychological function and social control. And this question rests softly in the background, not demanding answer, because its exploration continues naturally into the next layer of understanding, where judgment becomes consequence, and consequence begins to shape the imagination of what happens beyond the visible world, as the night carries awareness deeper into itself. As judgment settles into the inner landscape, it begins to take on a temporal dimension, extending beyond the present moment into imagined futures. And this extension marks the psychological origin of divine judgment as consequence, a concept that appeared across ancient civilizations as societies sought to understand not only whether actions were seen, but whether they endured. And in Abrahamic symbolism, divine judgment was never confined to immediate reaction. It unfolded slowly, measured across time, memory, and intention, reflecting an intuitive awareness that human behavior rarely reveals its full impact at once. And this awareness parallels much older traditions, such as the Egyptian weighing of the heart against truth, the Mesopotamian belief in posthumous accounting, and the Greek idea of moral balance restoring itself beyond mortal life, all suggesting that judgment functioned less as punishment and more as continuity, ensuring that actions retained meaning even when human witnesses disappeared. And psychologically, this continuity offered stability in unpredictable environments, because when life felt fragile and outcomes uncertain, the belief that behavior was ultimately accounted for reduced existential anxiety, providing a framework where restraint, sacrifice, and patience felt worthwhile. And modern anthropology supports this interpretation, observing that cultures with strong moral continuity narratives were better able to maintain cooperation across generations, preserving social norms even as individuals passed away. And as these narratives deepened within Abrahamic tradition, judgment became increasingly internalized, shaping not only fear of consequence, but anticipation of alignment, the quiet hope that intention mattered as much as outcome. And neuroscience offers insight here as well, showing that anticipation of evaluation activates the same neural systems involved in long-term planning, empathy, and impulse control, suggesting that fear of judgment, when balanced, serves adaptive regulation rather than distress. And yet, as you rest now, you may notice how easily anticipation can drift into rumination, how imagined futures can pull awareness away from the present, especially at night, when the mind is less anchored by external stimuli. And ancient storytellers recognized this risk, tempering judgment myths with ritual, forgiveness, and cyclical renewal, reminding listeners that consequence did not equate to condemnation, but to recalibration, an opportunity for return to balance. And this perspective appears repeatedly across cultures, in Hindu cycles of dissolution and rebirth, in indigenous practices of restoration rather than exile, and in early Christian emphasis on repentance as transformation rather than erasure, all reflecting a psychological truth, that fear loses its regulatory function when it overwhelms, and becomes harmful when it severs the individual from hope. And perhaps this explains why so many religious traditions place judgment within a larger narrative of order, not chaos, ensuring that fear remained contextual rather than absolute. And as this understanding settles, the idea of divine judgment begins to feel less like surveillance and more like structure, a symbolic expression of the mind's need to believe that actions ripple outward with coherence, even when immediate feedback is absent. And as you listen quietly, you may sense how this belief still influences modern life, shaping dreams, moral anxiety, creative expression, and even the subtle unease that surfaces when choices feel misaligned. And this unease is not evidence of external threat, but of internal calibration, the same mechanism that once guided early humans through communal survival, now operating within individual psychology. And the unresolved question that remains gently present is how this system shifted over time. When guidance hardened into fear and structure transformed into threat, a shift that did not originate in myth itself, but in how myth was used, a transition that continues to shape emotional experience today. And this question does not need to be answered immediately, because its exploration unfolds gradually, leading naturally into the next movement of the narrative, where obedience emerges not as submission, but as an adaptive response to uncertainty, carried quietly forward by stories meant to help humanity endure. As consequence stretches gently across time, the mind begins to seek stability in pattern, and from this desire emerges obedience, not as blind submission, but as a deeply practical response to uncertainty, shaped by environments where survival depended on coordinated behavior rather than individual impulse. And within Abrahamic symbolism, obedience was framed as alignment with divine order, a way of moving in rhythm with forces larger than any single person. And this framing did not originate in abstraction, but in lived reality, where early pastoral and agrarian communities faced unpredictable weather, scarce resources, and external threats that demanded collective discipline. And anthropological studies reveal that groups with strong shared rules were more resilient, because predictable behavior reduced internal conflict and conserved energy, and myths encoded this resilience into sacred narrative, transforming cooperation into virtue and disobedience into risk, not because deviation was inherently evil, but because instability carried real cost. And across cultures, similar patterns appeared in Vedic traditions where cosmic law governed action, in Chinese philosophy where harmony required adherence to order, and in indigenous American societies where ritual maintained balance with the land, all reinforcing the psychological truth that structure soothes anxiety when the world feels unstable. And neuroscience supports this, showing that predictable frameworks reduce cognitive load, allowing the brain to operate efficiently under stress. And when Abrahamic traditions emphasized obedience, they were responding to this same need, offering clear boundaries that reduced uncertainty. And yet, obedience was rarely portrayed as constant vigilance. It was integrated into daily rhythm through ritual, prayer, and repetition, becoming habitual rather than effortful. And this habit formation aligns with modern behavioral science, which notes that consistent routines reduce decision fatigue and emotional strain, freeing mental resources for rest and reflection. And as you rest now, perhaps noticing the comfort of routine breathing and familiar stillness, you may sense how predictability calms the nervous system, allowing awareness to drift without fear. And this calm was the original function of obedience narratives, to create internal stability that mirrored external order. And yet, as these narratives evolved, obedience sometimes became associated with threat rather than reassurance, particularly when authority used fear to enforce compliance, shifting the emotional tone from alignment to avoidance, a shift that left lasting impressions on the subconscious, especially during moments of quiet when internalized rules surface without context. And this is why obedience can feel both comforting and constraining, because it carries traces of its original purpose alongside later distortions. And as the night deepens, this duality becomes easier to observe without judgment, recognizing obedience as a psychological tool shaped by history rather than a personal flaw. And perhaps this invites a gentle question: whether the discomfort associated with obedience arises not from the act itself, but from losing sight of its original intention, to protect, coordinate, and preserve life in uncertain conditions. And this question rests softly, guiding awareness toward the next layer of the story, where obedience, once adaptive, begins to generate its own shadow, giving rise to the ancient fear of disobedience, a fear that echoes quietly through memory and dream, waiting to be understood rather than resisted. As obedience settles into habit and becomes woven into daily life, its absence begins to feel unsettling, and from this unease emerges the ancient fear of disobedience, not as rebellion against authority, but as anxiety about destabilizing the delicate balance that keeps communities intact. And in early Abrahamic societies, where rules govern not only morality but survival itself, deviation carried tangible risk, threatening access to shared resources, protection, and belonging. And this reality shaped stories that framed disobedience as dangerous long before it was described as sinful, embedding caution into memory through narrative rather than punishment alone. And similar patterns appear across cultures, in Mesopotamian myths where chaos followed broken order, in Egyptian belief where imbalance disrupted cosmic harmony, and in Chinese philosophy where deviation from the way created disorder, all reflecting the psychological insight that humans fear exclusion as deeply as physical harm. And neuroscience confirms this, showing that social rejection activates the same neural pathways as physical pain, suggesting that fear of disobedience is rooted not in abstract morality, but in embodied survival instinct. And as these instincts were passed down through generations, they became less conscious, settling into the subconscious as inherited caution, surfacing most clearly during quiet moments when the mind revisits unresolved tension, such as at night, when internalized rules speak more loudly without distraction. And myths offered language for this sensation, describing disobedience not as curiosity or growth, but as falling away from order, a framing that reduced uncertainty by discouraging deviation in unstable environments. And yet, as societies grew safer and more complex, the emotional residue of this fear often remained, detached from its original context, leading to guilt and anxiety even when no real threat existed. And this is where the psychological shadow of disobedience emerges, not as moral failure, but as memory without environment, an echo of ancient conditions carried into modern minds. And as you rest now, you may notice how the mind sometimes reacts strongly to imagined mistakes, replaying choices long after consequence has passed. And this reaction is not weakness, but vigilance shaped by history, a system designed to prevent harm before it occurs. And Jungian psychology recognizes this as the internalization of authority, where external rules become part of the psyche, regulating behavior automatically. And when balanced, this regulation supports integrity. But when overactive, it generates unnecessary distress, particularly during rest, when the mind seeks openness rather than control. And ancient traditions attempted to soften this by introducing forgiveness, atonement, and renewal, acknowledging that obedience without release becomes oppressive. And this recognition appears in ritual cycles across cultures, from cleansing ceremonies to days of rest, all designed to reset the nervous system and restore balance. And as this understanding settles, fear of disobedience begins to loosen its grip, revealing itself as protective rather than punitive, a signal from deep memory reminding the mind of connection and belonging. And perhaps this reframing allows the body to relax, recognizing that the system meant to protect no longer needs to be on constant alert. And as the night continues its gentle descent, awareness prepares to explore the next layer, where fear shifts from behavior to knowledge itself, and curiosity, once essential, becomes something to be restrained, giving rise to the ancient anxiety surrounding forbidden understanding, waiting quietly to be examined with the same calm attention. As fear loosens its hold on behavior, attention drifts toward something more subtle and more powerful, the fear of knowing too much, a concern that appears again and again in Abrahamic symbolism as the caution against forbidden knowledge. And this fear did not arise from opposition to learning itself, but from an intuitive awareness that knowledge changes behavior. sometimes faster than societies can adapt. And in early human communities, information carried risk as well as benefit. Because new understanding could disrupt established roles, challenge authority, or encourage actions that exceeded collective readiness. And myths gave shape to this tension by framing certain knowledge as dangerous when acquired without preparation, a theme that echoes far beyond the story of Eden, appearing in Mesopotamian tales where divine wisdom overwhelmed mortals, in Greek myths where Prometheus suffered for sharing fire, and in Vedic tradition where sacred knowledge required careful initiation, all reflecting the same psychological insight, that awareness expands faster than emotional regulation. And when these two grow out of balance, anxiety follows, and neuroscience supports this observation, showing that the brain's capacity to generate abstract thought often outpaces its ability to manage emotional consequence, leading to rumination, fear, and instability when information arrives without context. And ancient storytellers recognized this risk, encoding restraint into narrative so that curiosity could be guided rather than suppressed. And within Abrahamic tradition, forbidden knowledge often symbolizes premature autonomy, the moment when individuals act without communal grounding, exposing themselves to responsibility they are not yet equipped to carry. And this symbolism is psychological rather than literal, reflecting the developmental truth that insight brings accountability. And accountability can feel overwhelming when internal regulation is still forming. And as you listen now, perhaps noticing how certain thoughts feel heavier than others, how awareness sometimes seeks rest rather than expansion, you may sense the wisdom in this restraint, recognizing that not every question demands immediate answer, especially during moments meant for restoration. And similar guidance appears in Buddhist mindfulness, which encourages gentle observation without grasping, and in indigenous traditions that pace learning through story and ritual, all acknowledging that knowledge is safest when integrated slowly. And this pacing is essential for sleep, because the mind cannot rest while actively processing complex insight. And myths of forbidden knowledge provided an external explanation for this need, legitimizing pause without shame. And as societies evolved, these myths sometimes hardened into fear-based control, but their original purpose remains visible beneath the surface, a concern for psychological balance. And as the night deepens, this understanding invites a soft question, whether the discomfort associated with certain thoughts arises not because they are wrong, but because the mind is asking for time. And this question rests gently, encouraging patience rather than resistance, allowing curiosity to remain alive without disturbing rest. And as awareness drifts further inward, the narrative prepares to explore the next symbolic layer, where fear of knowledge transforms into fear of consequence, shaping visions of containment that extend beyond the visible world, waiting quietly to be understood as psychological structure rather than threat. As curiosity settles into patience, the imagination begins to reach for structure, seeking a place where consequence can rest without overwhelming the present moment. And from this need emerged the psychology behind hell, not as a landscape of torment, but as a symbolic container for excess fear, guilt, and unresolved consequence. A concept that appeared gradually across cultures as societies struggled to manage moral anxiety without allowing it to destabilize daily life. And within Abrahamic tradition, hell evolved over centuries, shaped by earlier Mesopotamian underworld concepts, Egyptian afterlife sorting, Greek realms of consequence, and later moral philosophy, each contributing layers of meaning that transformed vague unease into a defined destination. And psychologically, this destination served an important function, because when consequence feels infinite and immediate, the nervous system remains in constant alarm. Whereas when consequence is placed elsewhere, contained beyond the present moment, the mind can rest, knowing that order exists without needing to resolve everything now. And modern cognitive science reflects this dynamic, showing that anxiety decreases when fears are externalized and structured, even symbolically, rather than remaining diffuse and internal. And myths of hell provided exactly this structure, relocating overwhelming moral tension into narrative space, allowing individuals to function without carrying unbearable internal pressure. And similar symbolic containment appears across traditions. In Norse realms where dishonor had location, in Mesoamerican cosmology where souls passed through trials, and in Buddhist imagery where suffering represented attachment rather than punishment, all offering frameworks that organized emotional consequence into intelligible form. And as you rest now, perhaps noticing how naming fears can sometimes reduce their intensity, you may recognize how these myths worked not by increasing terror, but by giving fear boundaries, allowing it to exist without consuming awareness. And within Abrahamic symbolism, hell was rarely emphasized alone. It existed alongside mercy, repentance, and return, reinforcing the idea that consequence was part of balance, not finality. And this balance mirrors psychological regulation, where accountability must coexist with forgiveness to maintain mental health. And when this equilibrium was lost, fear became excessive, lingering in the subconscious long after its regulatory purpose ended, surfacing during sleep as unease or symbolic imagery. And ancient storytellers attempted to mitigate this by framing hell as distant, avoidable, and governed by law rather than chaos, a place where order continued even in consequence. And this framing soothed rather than intensified anxiety. Because chaos, not consequence, is what the mind fears most. And as the night deepens, this understanding allows the image of hell to soften, transforming from threat into boundary, a symbolic edge that keeps the present moment livable. And perhaps this invites a quiet realization that the most powerful function of these myths was not to frighten humanity into obedience, but to protect the psyche from carrying too much weight at once, distributing moral complexity across time and story. And as awareness drifts further inward, the narrative prepares to explore why this containment needed to be eternal, why permanence itself became part of the story, a development rooted not in cruelty, but in memory, continuity, and the human struggle to imagine limits to consequence in an uncertain world. As consequence finds its container and anxiety is given form, the mind begins to ask a deeper question: why consequence needed to last forever? And from this question emerged the idea of eternal punishment, not as an expression of cruelty, but as a response to the limitations of human memory and the fragility of moral continuity. Because in early oral societies, where history lived in story rather than record, permanence carried weight, ensuring that lessons endured beyond individual lives. And within Abrahamic symbolism, eternity did not initially signify endless suffering, but unbroken significance, the assurance that actions mattered beyond the moment and were not erased by time. And this assurance stabilized communities facing uncertainty. Because when environments were unpredictable and justice uneven, the belief in lasting consequence restored balance psychologically, offering a sense that meaning could not be lost to chance. And similar concepts appear across cultures. In Egyptian belief, where the soul's outcome echoed indefinitely; in Greek philosophy, where fate extended beyond mortal lifespan; and in Hindu cosmology, where karmic consequence unfolded across cycles, all reflecting the same cognitive need to imagine a moral universe that did not reset with death. And neuroscience provides insight here, showing that humans struggle to emotionally process impermanence, often experiencing anxiety when actions feel transient or forgotten. An eternal consequence countered this anxiety by anchoring behavior in continuity, making restraint and sacrifice feel worthwhile even when immediate reward was absent. And as you rest now, perhaps sensing how meaning feels heavier when it endures. You may recognize this impulse in modern life, where people seek legacy, memory, and lasting impact as reassurance against disappearance. And myths of eternal punishment and reward externalize this desire, transforming abstract fear of oblivion into structured narrative. And yet, as with many symbolic systems, what began as stabilizing sometimes became overwhelming when taken literally or emphasized without balance, leaving traces of fear that surface during quiet moments, especially at night, when the mind contemplates time without distraction. And ancient traditions attempted to temper this by pairing eternity with mercy, repentance, and cycles of renewal, acknowledging that permanence without compassion becomes unbearable. And this balance appears in many belief systems, where eternal order coexists with transformation, reflecting a psychological truth that humans need both consequence and hope to remain emotionally regulated. And as this understanding settles, eternity begins to feel less like endless suffering and more like unbroken meaning, a symbolic way of ensuring that values persist across generations. And perhaps this reframing allows tension to release, recognizing that the fear associated with eternal punishment is not about pain itself, but about the desire for actions to matter, for choices to leave imprint. And as the night continues its gentle descent, awareness prepares to turn inward again, toward the shadow this permanence cast within the individual, where consequence becomes identity and moral boundaries begin to shape the self, giving rise to the psychology of sin, waiting quietly to be understood not as corruption, but as containment. As permanence settles into identity, consequence no longer remains only an external concept. It moves inward, shaping how the individual understands the self. And it is here that the shadow psychology of sin begins to take form, not as corruption, but as boundary, a symbolic line drawn between what may be expressed openly and what must be restrained for the sake of cohesion. And within Abrahamic tradition, sin was never simply an act. It was a condition of misalignment, a state where intention, behavior, and order drifted out of harmony. And this idea mirrors much older psychological insights found across cultures, where imbalance rather than evil was the primary concern, as seen in Egyptian notions of disorder, Greek ideas of excess, and Chinese philosophy that warned against deviation from balance, all recognizing that unregulated impulse threatens both individual stability and group survival. And from a Jungian perspective, sin functions as a shadow marker, identifying aspects of the psyche that society cannot fully integrate and therefore pushes inward, where they remain active but unseen, influencing behavior through guilt, anxiety, and projection. And neuroscience supports this dynamic, showing that suppression of impulse without understanding increases internal tension, activating stress responses that surface most clearly during rest, when conscious control weakens. And ancient myths acknowledge this by giving the shadow symbolic language, allowing individuals to relate to inner conflict without becoming overwhelmed by it. And as you rest now, perhaps noticing how certain thoughts carry emotional charge even without action, you may sense how the mind maintains internal boundaries automatically, guided by inherited moral frameworks. And these frameworks were not designed to punish thought, but to prevent action that endangered fragile social systems. And yet, over time, when shadow material was labeled as inherently wrong rather than conditionally restrained, fear intensified, and the subconscious absorbed this fear as identity, leading to the sensation of being flawed rather than misaligned. A subtle but powerful shift that still echoes in modern emotional life, particularly during moments of quiet reflection. And ancient traditions attempted to soften this effect through confession, atonement, and ritual release, mechanisms that allowed shadow material to surface safely before returning to balance. And similar practices appear worldwide, in indigenous cleansing rites, Buddhist acknowledgement of desire, and African communal restoration ceremonies, all recognizing that shadow requires expression to remain regulated. And as this understanding settles, sin begins to appear less as stain and more as signal, pointing toward areas of unmet need, unexpressed impulse, or unresolved fear. And perhaps this reframing invites gentleness, allowing the body to relax its vigilance, recognizing that internal boundaries exist to protect, not condemn. And as the night deepens, awareness prepares to encounter another symbol of overwhelming order, one that inspired or rather than comfort, the figure of the angel, whose presence reveals not softness, but magnitude, and whose fear was rooted not in malice, but in the human encounter with something too vast to be easily integrated. As the inner boundary of sin settles into quiet recognition, the narrative turns toward figures that embodied order itself, forms so precise and overwhelming that they unsettled rather than comforted, giving rise to the question of why angels were terrifying, not because they threatened harm, but because they represented a scale of reality that exceeded human proportion. And in Abrahamic symbolism, angels were not gentle companions, but messengers of structure, appearing suddenly, speaking with certainty, and dissolving ambiguity wherever they arrived. And this certainty is what made them unsettling, because the human mind is adapted for gradual understanding, not immediate total clarity. And when confronted with absolute order, the nervous system reacts with awe mixed with fear, a response documented across cultures when humans encounter forces beyond comprehension. And similar figures appear worldwide, in Mesopotamian winged guardians, in Egyptian beings who maintained cosmic balance, in Vedic devas who embodied natural law, and in Japan, see kami whose presence disrupted ordinary perception, all reflecting the same psychological response to overwhelming structure. And neuroscience explains this reaction through the concept of cognitive overload, where stimuli exceed the brain's capacity to integrate smoothly, triggering heightened arousal rather than calm. And angels, as symbols, represent information delivered without negotiation, truth without gradual adaptation, which the psyche experiences as intensity rather than comfort. And this is why angelic encounters in Scripture are often preceded by reassurance, not because danger is imminent, but because the human system requires calming before absorbing magnitude. And as you rest now, perhaps noticing how sudden insight can feel destabilizing, even when positive, you may recognize this pattern, understanding that fear sometimes arises not from threat, but from excess clarity. And ancient storytellers encoded this understanding into angelic imagery, framing these beings as powerful yet non-hostile, emphasizing that fear was a natural response to proximity with order rather than evidence of wrongdoing. And this framing protected individuals from interpreting awe as guilt, allowing reverence without collapse. And Jungian psychology later described similar encounters as archetypal experiences, moments when the psyche confronts something larger than the ego, requiring humility and integration rather than resistance. And these encounters often occur in dreams, where symbolic figures appear luminous, authoritative, and unsettling, reflecting the mind's attempt to process large-scale meaning during rest. And across traditions, guidance followed these encounters, encouraging grounding, rest, and return to ordinary rhythm, acknowledging that human consciousness needs time to absorb what transcends it. And as this understanding settles, angels transform from objects of fear into symbols of scale, reminders that not all that unsettles is harmful, and that all can coexist with safety when approached gently. And perhaps this realization allows the body to soften further, releasing tension associated with judgment and threat, recognizing that some fears are simply the nervous system adjusting to magnitude. And as the night continues its descent, awareness prepares to weave these symbols together: observation, judgment, consequence, shadow, and order into a single interior experience, where fear becomes internal sensation rather than external force, waiting quietly to be understood as part of the human design rather than an error within it. As the figures of order soften and recede into symbol, the experience of being seen returns once more, now transformed by everything that has unfolded, revealing the fear of being seen by the sacred not as surveillance, but as intimacy, the awareness that nothing within the self is truly hidden from meaning. And in Abrahamic imagination, divine sight gradually moved from sky to soul, from watching actions to knowing thoughts, a shift that mirrored the evolution of human self-awareness itself. As societies learn not only to regulate behavior, but to reflect upon intention, and this inward turn was both stabilizing and unsettling, because when observation becomes internal, there is no distance to retreat into, and ancient traditions recognize this vulnerability, embedding it into prayer, confession, and ritual silence, allowing the individual to approach inner awareness gradually rather than all at once, and similar patterns appear across cultures. In Buddhist mindfulness practices that observe thought without judgment, in Native American vision traditions that emphasize respectful witnessing, and in African spiritual systems where ancestors were felt rather than seen, all acknowledging that being perceived by something larger does not require fear when approached with acceptance. And neuroscience supports this, showing that self-observation activates regions associated with emotional regulation when practiced gently, but triggers anxiety when paired with harsh evaluation. And myths attempted to guide this balance by framing sacred observation as knowing rather than accusing, offering reassurance that awareness itself was not punishment. And as you rest now, perhaps sensing how thoughts arise and dissolve without effort, you may notice that awareness can exist without commentary, that the mind can witness itself without tightening, and this capacity is what ancient stories quietly encouraged. Long before psychological language existed, and when fear arose around being seen, it often reflected imbalance, moments when self-observation became entangled with threat rather than understanding, a distortion shaped by historical pressures rather than original intention. And across religious symbolism, reassurance appears again and again, reminders not to fear presence, not because fear is wrong, but because presence itself is neutral. And as this realization settles, the sensat ion of being seen loses its edge, becoming simply awareness, steady and calm. And perhaps this is why night, when external observation fades, invites inner witnessing naturally, allowing the mind to practice presence without demand. And as the narrative continues its gentle descent, this inner witnessing prepares the ground for synthesis, where sacred fear, once externalized into gods, angels, and consequence, is recognized as an internal system of care, shaped by evolution, culture, and memory. And this recognition opens the way toward resolution, where fear no longer needs symbol to exist, because it has been understood, integrated, and softened into quiet attention, guiding the mind toward rest rather than vigilance. As sacred observation becomes familiarity rather than threat, fear completes its inward journey, settling fully within the individual as an internal system rather than an external force. And it is here that fear becomes something quiet, persistent, and deeply personal, no longer attached to gods, angels, or distant consequences, but woven into self-evaluation, habit, and emotional response, shaping modern anxiety in ways that feel detached from their ancient origins. And this transformation did not occur abruptly. It unfolded slowly as societies grew safer, laws became more stable, and survival depended less on immediate obedience and more on internal regulation, causing the structures once held by myth to migrate into psychology, where they continue to operate silently, especially during moments of rest, when external demands fall away. And across Abrahamic cultures, This inward shift can be traced through changing emphasis. From visible law to conscience, from collective ritual to private reflection, from public consequence to internal guilt, mirroring a broader human movement toward individual identity. And cross-culturally, similar shifts occurred, as Greek philosophy turned toward ethics of the self, as Buddhist practice emphasized internal observation, and as indigenous traditions balanced communal memory with personal vision, all acknowledging that fear, once necessary for survival, now required integration rather than reinforcement. And neuroscience supports this evolution, showing that the same neural circuits once activated by external threat now respond to imagined evaluation, self-criticism, and moral concern, creating stress without danger, particularly in quiet environments where the mind turns inward unchecked. And this explains why nighttime often amplifies moral anxiety, unresolved guilt, and existential unease. Because the internal observer becomes most active when distractions fade, and ancient myths anticipated this, offering symbolic companions to ease the transition, whereas modern life often leaves individuals alone with internalized systems that no longer have narrative context. And as you listen now, perhaps noticing thoughts evaluating themselves without instruction, you may sense how automatic this process is, how deeply it has been trained by generations of meaning-making. And Jungian psychology described this internal authority as the superego or shadow judge, not as an enemy, but as a misaligned protector, continuing its task long after its original environment has changed. And when unexamined, it generates fear without purpose. But when understood, it can soften into guidance without distress. And this understanding is what allows ancient fear to release its grip, transforming vigilance into awareness, and across culture, rituals of rest, forgiveness, and silence evolved to support this release, creating intentional spaces where self-evaluation could pause, allowing the nervous system to reset. And sleep itself became one of the most powerful of these spaces, a nightly return to safety where internal systems could downshift without consequence. And perhaps this is why myths were often shared at night, not to activate fear, but to contextualize it, reminding the listener that the sensations arising within them were shared, inherited, and temporary. And as this realization settles, fear begins to feel less personal, more like weather passing through the mind, shaped by history rather than identity. And this shift invites gentleness, allowing the body to relax its grip on self-monitoring, recognizing that awareness does not require punishment to function. And as the narrative approaches its resolution, all the symbols explored begin to converge, revealing sacred fear not as a mistake humanity made, but as a tool humanity outgrew, one that still deserves understanding rather than rejection. And this understanding prepares the ground for the final integration, where ancient symbols find their place within modern consciousness, no longer commanding attention, but offering quiet context as the mind drifts naturally toward rest. As the ancient symbols settle into understanding, their presence in the modern world becomes easier to recognize, no longer hidden within scripture or ritual alone, but woven into art, cinema, dreams, and the quiet emotional patterns that surface when the mind slows. Because sacred fear did not disappear when belief systems evolved. It adapted, finding new language through which to express the same inherited sensitivities. And today, the all-seeing presence appears as surveillance anxiety, self-comparison, and the sense of being evaluated even in solitude, while judgment echoes in perfectionism, fear of failure, and the quiet unease that arises when rest feels undeserved. And these experiences are not signs of personal weakness, but continuations of an ancient regulatory system that once protected fragile communities and now operates without clear instruction. And cross-cultural mythology helps illuminate this continuity, showing how modern stories repeat old patterns, with watchful forces, moral consequences, and unseen order appearing in contemporary narratives across cultures. From science fiction guardians to psychological thrillers, each reflecting the same human concern with being seen, measured, and aligned. And neuroscience explains why these themes persist, noting that the brain is a prediction engine shaped by evolutionary pressures, always scanning for social consequence and meaning, even when immediate danger is absent. And when external structures no longer guide this scanning, the mind turns inward, sometimes amplifying fear in the absence of ritual release. And this is why sleep becomes such a powerful threshold, because it is one of the few remaining spaces where conscious control softens naturally, allowing inherited patterns to surface without resistance. And ancient myths once served as companions during this transition, contextualizing fear so it could pass rather than linger. And perhaps this is why, even now, religious imagery, moral anxiety, and symbolic figures appear most vividly in dreams, where the mind processes unresolved tension using the oldest available language. And Jung described this as the collective unconscious speaking through archetype, not to frighten, but to integrate, offering images that ask to be felt rather than judged. And as you listen now, resting within this gentle flow, you may notice how fear loses its sharpness when understood as memory rather than message, how awareness softens when it no longer needs to defend itself against inherited expectation. And across cultures, healing traditions recognize this, creating spaces of rest, meditation, and storytelling where the nervous system could recalibrate, allowing ancient vigilance to release into modern safety. And this recalibration is not an act of forgetting, but of honoring, acknowledging that these fears once served a purpose, and that their presence today is a sign of continuity rather than error. And as this understanding settles, the symbols explored throughout this narrative no longer feel heavy, but familiar, like old tools resting unused, respected for what they once did and free to remain quiet now. And this quiet prepares the mind for closure, where the final insight emerges naturally, not as explanation, but as felt sense that fear, when understood, does not demand attention. It dissolves into awareness, allowing rest to arrive without effort, guided by the same human capacity that once invented gods, judgment, and consequence. Now choosing calm integration over vigilance, as the night completes its gentle arc. As the narrative reaches its quiet resting place, everything that once felt distant, divine, or overwhelming returns gently to where it began, within the human mind itself, revealing that sacred fear was never meant to linger as threat, but to function as a guide through uncertainty, a temporary structure built to support fragile awareness in a world that offered little predictability. And when that structure was no longer needed in the same way, its echoes remained, not as commands, but as memories, shaping how attention responds to silence, darkness, and rest. And this is the quiet truth beneath biblical and Abrahamic fears, that they were not created to disturb sleep, but to protect it, to ensure that meaning, order, and continuity existed even when the world grew dark and human vigilance could not remain constant. And across history, myth stepped in where certainty ended, offering symbolic guardians for the vulnerable hours, reminding the mind that it was held within something larger than itself, whether named as God, order, law, or memory. And modern science now affirms what ancient storytellers sensed intuitively, that the brain requires reassurance in order to release control, that sleep emerges not when fear is defeated, but when it is understood and allowed to settle. And as you rest now, perhaps noticing how thoughts slow and lose urgency, you may feel how awareness does not disappear in sleep. It simply changes form, continuing its quiet work beneath the surface, integrating experience without judgment. And this is the same process myths once described symbolically, when they spoke of divine knowledge, moral accounting, and unseen order, translating internal regulation into narrative language so it could be shared, remembered, and trusted. And in recognizing this, fear softens into familiarity, no longer an external force watching from above, but an internal signal that has completed its task and can now rest. And this realization does not require belief or rejection, only acknowledgement. The understanding that what once guided humanity through danger can now be thanked and released, allowing the nervous system to settle into safety. And perhaps this is the most peaceful inheritance these myths offer. Not obedience, not punishment, but continuity. The reassurance that the mind has always known how to protect itself, and that even in darkness, it remembers how to let go. And as the last symbols fade into stillness, there is nothing left to resolve, nothing left to watch or be watched. Only the steady rhythm of breath and the quiet certainty that rest is not an absence of awareness, but its gentlest form. And within this form, humanity has always found renewal, night after night, generation after generation, carried forward not by fear, but by the deep and patient intelligence of the sleeping mind.